We'll be starting the session in a moment. If you have any connection or technical issues, try refreshing your browser first. If this doesn't work, please go to the Help Desk by clicking Sessions on the left, or click the People tab on the right and search Help Desk to send a private message. Thank you for joining us.
Welcome, everyone, to the Menus of Change National Leadership Summit virtual series, a joint initiative of the Culinary Institute of America and the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health Department of Nutrition. This year's summit is our largest ever, with more than 1,000 industry professionals joining virtually on the interactive Kaufman platform, and thousands more expected to view the 6-week program via live stream, Facebook, and YouTube. Welcome to you all, and a special welcome to our international viewers around the world. I'm Jacquelyn, Director of Programs and Special Projects for the Strategic Initiatives Group at the Culinary Institute of America, and your host for this first in our 6-week series. Under normal circumstances, this would be the time that we might ask those of you who have been to a previous Menus of Change conference to raise your hand. Of course, that method of polling is a little bit harder for us to assess in our current format. So instead, I encourage you to let us know on the polls tab if this is your first time ever experiencing the summit, or if you are an MOC veteran who is adapting to these new conditions as we are, and tuning in for your 2nd, 5th, or possibly even 8th time through our virtual programming. Regardless of if you have dutifully made the trek to the CIA's campus in Hyde Park, and here's a picture of what the campus will look like in just a few months with some fall foliage, or if this is your initiation into the MOC community, we are incredibly grateful to have you join us today. Even as we all navigate a new world and completely different operating conditions, food and climate change, the drive for sustainable food systems, the urgent need to reverse the still growing global burden of food-linked chronic diseases, and the acceleration of innovation and successful business strategies in the food service sector to meet these challenges, all of this continues to be vital work. As such, we are thrilled to be able to bring you a truly inspiring summit lineup of top experts, chefs, and business leaders representing the perspectives of health and nutrition, sustainability and the environment, culinary insight, and the business of food service to help you advance this work. We look forward to not only sharing content presentations with you over the next 6 weeks, and by the way, don't forget to use the password emailed to registered attendees earlier this week to access all of the presentations and recipes on our website, but also actively engaging with you through our very robust hop-in platform. In addition to our event chat, you can direct chat any participant by searching for their name under the People tab. A red dot and number next to the envelope on the top right will indicate that you have a new message waiting for you. And during the networking breaks and reception, we'll be activating more features through which to connect with other participants. Here's a quick preview. Our networking feature randomly matches you with another attendee for a quick 4-minute chat. Think of it as the one-on-one, hello, what brings you to MOC? Serendipitous conversation you might strike up at the coffee station at the Marriott Pavilion on our main campus. You can also visit the Expo tab to visit with our sponsors to hear about new product developments, consumer insights, sustainable operations, or even just to thank them for their support in continuing our work. This slide shows you what is on deck for this week, but the sponsors featured and their themed programming will change week to week. So we hope you'll stop by there often to say hello. Our Meet the Author booth is where our presenter authors will be waiting to chat with you, and we've got links to purchase their books as well. This week's author is Dr. Walter Willett, Professor of Epidemiology and Nutrition at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. And speaking of books, you'll be entered into a raffle to win some just by participating in the networking break activities. So we encourage you to participate in as many of these activities as possible in the spirit of community and sharing that is always central to the CIA conferences. And if you participate in each of the 6 weeks, you'll have a chance to win free registration and travel to next year's conference in Hyde Park, New York. Amidst all of these activities, we hope you'll embrace our virtual conference reality and ask questions and join the conversation by clicking on the green Share Audio and Video button in the expo booths and the breakout sessions. For those of you joining by live stream or perhaps viewing this as a recorded webcast, we hope you'll also interact with us through the comments as well as on our social media channels. Don't forget to use our hashtag CIAMOC and CIA Plant Forward. As you might have imagined, it has been quite a feat turning this in-person conference around into the forum you see now. Before we go any further, we'd like to give immense thanks to our program sponsors, without whose support this gathering, whether virtual or in person, would not be possible. Thank you to our platinum sponsor, Kellogg's Away From Home, our gold sponsor, Land O'Lakes, our bronze sponsors, Nestle Professional and Oatly, as well as our supporting and corporate sponsors. Their sustained support of Menus of Change helps us bring this programming to you tuition-free, and we hope you'll make a point of visiting them in the expo section. Now, to get us started today, it is my pleasure to introduce Greg Drescher, Vice President of Strategic Initiatives and Industry Leadership at the Culinary Institute of America, who is joining us from Sacramento today. Greg, take it away.
Thanks, Jackie, and welcome everyone. 8 years ago, as an outgrowth of a long collaboration with the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, we launched our Menus of Change initiative. Our vision was to uncover opportunities for innovation at the intersection of nutrition science, sustainability, and culinary insight. Adding to that integration of critical perspectives, we then asked, how can this inspire future industry business models? And finally, central to our framing of this initiative has been the conviction that chefs everywhere can play a transformative role in creating the change we need in food systems. Now, here we are in the summer of 2020, in a world ravaged by this virus, our restaurant industry struggling to regain its footing. And yet the macro issues, as Jackie mentioned, that informed our Menus of Change initiative from the beginning, rising chronic disease, a degraded environment, and climate change, are still very much with us, and also threaten to derail our future if we do not act. So over the next 6 weeks, we'll consider a whole host of vital topics, from what lessons we should learn from the pandemic to critical supply chain issues, consumer insight around shifting food values, intergenerational perspectives on effective communication strategies, and much more. A key reference point for all of these discussions is our 24 principles of healthy, sustainable menus, as pictured here in an infographic. We're gratified that these principles have inspired change in professional kitchens all across our country. Earlier this week, you should have received a link to our 2020 Summit and Resources Overview that will connect you to a whole collection of resources we have developed to help you facilitate these conversations in your own organizations. One recent area of focus for Menus of Change has been to advance a framework for menu design we call Plant Forward. This is a big tent approach that includes vegetarian and vegan preferences, but acknowledges that the biggest opportunity for change is to build on the already shifting preferences of a much larger segment of the population who may want to eat less meat, fewer foods from animal sources, but don't want to completely eliminate these foods from their diets. Plant Forward by the Numbers, another recent CIA-Harvard collaboration, aggregates health, environmental, consumer, and business data from just before the outbreak of COVID-19, teeing up the obvious question, which we'll consider in this summit: where do consumers land on this trend in a post-COVID-19 world? The scale of the challenges facing us requires not just a few new additions to our menus, but a more aggressive commitment to innovation and rethinking of culinary strategy, literally from the ground up. Fortunately, all across our country, we're seeing many thousands of chefs and operators stepping forward and charting new directions. In kitchens from New York to California, chefs are elevating the visibility of vegetables and other healthy plant-sourced foods. Many of us are drawing inspiration from plant-forward food cultures around the world. From Asia to the Mediterranean, Africa, and Latin America, a rich diversity of plant-forward culinary techniques have evolved over centuries. A couple of years back, we teamed up with the EAT Foundation to curate a global list of 50 chefs who are leading the way on Plant Forward. More recently, we partnered with QSR Magazine to highlight Plant Forward innovators in the fast casual sector, and with FSR to do the same in the full service sector. Last month, we completed our second annual Global Plant Forward Culinary Summit, also virtually. And we are now working with Google, the food team at Google, to develop an ambitious new Plant Forward certification initiative to share with the global food service sector in the coming months. And then one final thought. Let's never forget that our success with designing change and accelerating innovation will hinge in no small part on whether we can still deliver deliciousness. In shaping and supporting the work of the Menus of Change, we are grateful for the critical contributions of our Scientific and Technical Advisory Council, headed by Harvard nutrition professor Walter Willett, who we'll hear from shortly, and our Business Leadership Council, which is chaired by Michael Kaufman, a partner in the Astor Group and senior lecturer at the Harvard Business School. Working with Vice Chair Siobhan Hansen, who heads up nutrition and food choice architecture on the food team at Google. It's now my pleasure to invite Michael to add his welcome and share some opening thoughts. Michael, over to you.
Thanks so much, Greg, and good morning, afternoon, or evening, whichever is right for each of you in the audience. Well, here we are, opening the first of 6 virtual sessions of Menus of Change with our largest conference speaker lineup ever. How did that come to be? Well, as the pandemic rapidly escalated in March, we held a conference call of the Business Leadership Council on April 1. We focused on 2 issues. First, with the unprecedented crisis for our industry brewing, would the issues examined by Menus of Change be viewed as relevant? And second, the council resoundingly said absolutely. And second, would we be able to meet as scheduled in June on the CIA campus? We didn't know, but thought that was unlikely. In the ensuing 3 short months, this conference was completely restructured from in-person to virtual, and with new and important insights stemming from the pandemic itself. A huge thank you to the CIA team led by Greg, the Business Leadership Council, and my council leadership partner, Siobhan Hansen, and the CIA and our sponsors, who generously agreed that this conference should be offered tuition-free to food service operators. An extraordinary recognition of the current dire state of the industry and restaurant and food service industry. We cannot overstate the impact of COVID-19 on our industry. Millions of our team members are furloughed or laid off. Thousands of restaurants have closed, many permanently. Many of those that remain open are surviving, not thriving, relying on takeout or delivery. Capacity limitations, additional safety protocols, all challenge financial viability. Our industry was projected to attain $899 billion in sales in 2020. Current projections peg that number at $659 billion, a decline of $240 billion, returning our industry to a revenue level of more than 7 years ago. We are indeed engaged in a fight to stay alive, documented in this article published by Harvard Business School last week. Of course, this fight is not just about our businesses. It is also about our public health. If there were ever a case study of the possible tension between business and public health, this is it. We understand the business impact, and hardly a day passes when we don't see experts from the Harvard Chan School of Public Health or other institutions helping us understand the public health implications of this virus. Which brings me back to the importance and relevance of Menus of Change, even in the face of COVID-19. We know that we don't have the luxury of only focusing on one crisis at a time, when the global burden of chronic disease, climate change, and other environmental issues, and the changing values and preferences of younger generations are clearly signaling that we cannot just build back the same as we were, even though that in itself would be a tall order. Successful innovators are probing possible new business models. Investors are changing what they're paying attention to, and clearly the market itself is shifting, sending conflicting messages simultaneously. And though our industry has been hit hard, nevertheless, I would put it against any other industry sector. The drive, the creativity, and the commitment of the women and men of our industry to their dreams, their visions, their businesses that they built, and the customers they serve. And that gives us hope that we will meet any challenge. So let's get started. I am honored to introduce Eliza Barkley, Health and Science Editor at Vox, where she oversees Vox.com's award-winning health, science, and climate coverage. She will moderate our first general session, Lessons from the Pandemic, Our Health, Our Planet, Our Future. Over to you, Eliza.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to moderate this panel. In this opening session, we will be exploring lessons to be drawn so far from the COVID-19 pandemic for the state of food choices, our food system, public health, and the environment. Of course, while most chefs and operators in the restaurant and food service industry are focused on the near-term challenges of reopening, there are many other critical imperatives that have not gone away. And so we'll be focused on how to build back to secure a healthier, more sustainable future for ourselves and the planet. We're going to change the order today because of a couple of technical issues. Walter will be with us shortly, but first I'm very pleased to introduce Dan Schrag, Professor of Environmental Science and Engineering at Harvard University. He is also the director of the Harvard University Center for the Environment. Dan, let's see your presentation.
Thank you, Eliza, and thanks to everyone. And many years ago, Walter Willett invited me to one of the early meetings of Menus of Change. I think it's an incredibly exciting initiative. And what I want to do is, in some ways, set the stage for Walter to talk about nutrition in the context of what has become the greatest environmental challenge of all, which is climate change. That isn't to say that it's the only one. Clean air, clean water remain a huge and important pressing issues, especially in certain regions. And of course, biodiversity is also incredibly important, as well as many other local issues. But I think the scale of climate change has made it preeminent among all of our concerns about how to deal with a healthy planet. And I think it's very interesting to think about the role that chefs can play in actually furthering this discussion. And I look forward to that conversation. I'm going to share with you just a few slides here that we're going to try to go through relatively quickly. I want to sort of sum up 30 years of working as a climate scientist on this problem to just make it really clear that climate change is a super hard problem. It's not just hard, it's super hard. And it's super hard because of two simple reasons. First of all, it's a global collective action problem. Now, human beings in general are bad at collective action. We tend to be tribal, adversarial. We don't necessarily naturally work together. But it's especially difficult when the problem, like climate change, involves a global atmosphere that mixes, and therefore everything we do together matters. That means a solution really has to be global. It's not enough for the US or for Europe to solve it. We really require global participation, and that's incredibly challenging. And to make matters worse, on top of it being a global collective action problem, almost all aspects of climate change have long timescales. Now, we know from this COVID disaster that humans aren't terribly good at long timescales. When the governor reopened in Georgia, people said, wait a second, it's been 3 or 4 weeks. How come cases haven't gone up? And good epidemiologists said, just be patient, they will, but it may take 3, 4, 5 doubling times before you see a significant jump in the number of sick people. And sure enough, 8 to 10 weeks later, we've seen cases rise, and now, unfortunately, deaths rise as well. Well, climate change is the same, but instead of weeks, we're talking about centuries to millennia. The timescale of climate change is incredibly long. Let me just give you an example of this. This graph shows the spatial footprint of climate change. It's the global average temperature from the last 5 years, from 2015 to 2019, relative to a baseline, which is mid-century, mid-20th century. And what you see is that the northern hemisphere has warmed up a lot, the Arctic in particular, but I hope you can also see that the continents have warmed up a lot more than the oceans. And this is just simple physics. It's what we expect. The way the Earth system works is we've added greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, and the Earth is heating up, trying to achieve a new equilibrium. But the oceans are resisting that. The oceans are like a giant cold bathtub in your bedroom. If you went to bed and most of your bedroom was covered with a giant bathtub, it would be cold there. And you'd turn the thermostat up, but it would take a long time because you'd have to warm the bathtub up before your room would feel warm. Well, that's essentially what's happening with the oceans. The planet is trying to warm up, and the oceans are resisting it. That's good news in that the world is not warming up as quickly as it otherwise would if it were all land. But it's bad in the sense that we've committed ourselves probably to 1,000 years of warming, even if we were to stop burning fossil fuels tomorrow. That's the time scale of climate change. And there are, of course, many other long time scales in the system. The Greenland ice sheet, for example, is melting slowly, about a little less than 1 millimeter a year of global sea level rise. And we have records of this. This is a picture from a satellite called GRACE, which measures the gravitational field of the Earth. But the problem is that the time scale of ice sheet melting is probably millennia, and it's already started to melt. The problem is we're not quite sure how you stop it. Once it's started, this is a continuing problem, and we are committing future generations to deal with ever accelerating sea level rise, not just our children and our grandchildren, but literally for hundreds and maybe even thousands of generations of humans. That's kind of hard to deal with. There's also some good news. Solar and wind. This is a graph showing that the new electricity capacity in the US, almost 80% of it, about 75% of new electricity capacity is wind and solar. That's really good news and extraordinary progress. Unfortunately, the total rate of construction is still far too low. At current rates of construction, and this is a great acceleration, we would need to, it's just getting to 30% wind and solar, we would still take about 50 years to do it. And that's way too slow. So the question really is, how do we accelerate this process? It looks right now that changing behavior or changing technology is possible, but it's not happening fast enough. And we have to begin to face the fact that it remains possible, even likely, that we're going to fall short of what some people suggest as reasonable goals for the world. What does that mean? Unfortunately, what that means is that we're going to have some challenges. Here's a picture from 2012 when half of US counties were in emergency drought condition. This was corn damaged by extreme heat in Illinois. We've seen this in Europe in 2003, in Russia in 2010, US in 2012, that when there are extreme heat and drought, we see huge reductions in crops and food shortages and price spikes all over the world. We need to think about being a global community for how to handle that. We saw the fires in California a couple of summers ago. This was the fires in Australia, continental scale fires, extraordinary things. This was a picture of Hurricane Harvey that hit Houston a few years ago. As a storm goes, it wasn't terrible in terms of wind damage, but it rained 60 inches on Houston in less than 3 days. 60 inches. Where I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, 2 inches is a flood. 60 inches is biblical. We had a major US city completely underwater. And then, of course, in 2012, we had Hurricane Sandy that came ashore in New Jersey and flooded New York City. You see the subways here flooded. Maybe the interesting part, though, is that there was some light at the end of the tunnel. This is a picture during Hurricane Sandy of Lower Manhattan with the lights out. And you see there was one building in particular that happens to be Goldman Sachs, all lit up. Why is that? It's not because Goldman Sachs had a special deal with Con Edison. It's because Goldman Sachs had put their generators on the 3rd floor. Many buildings had backup generators, and they kept them in the basement, which turns out is a very bad idea when there's a big flood. There's another example of this. This is Hurricane Michael that hit the Florida Panhandle. And you can see the devastation of homes. And then there's this house in the center called the Sand Palace that came through completely unscathed. The architects had designed it for a Category 5 hurricane. So this is, to me, a path forward and something we need to think about in terms of global food systems. I want to show you a quote from Charles Darwin. It's not the strongest of the species that survives, not the most intelligent that survives. It's the one that is most adaptable to change. Now, I am not saying we shouldn't continue to reduce emissions and change our energy systems and ultimately solve the climate problem. But I'm also a realist. I'm a scientist who observes the world and tries to describe it as clearly as I can. And I can tell you that we're not going to avoid all of the impacts of climate change. And so we have to think about how to adapt to it. And to me, menus of change, whether we're talking about fires or floods or droughts, menus of change can be a catalyst for that kind of awareness and behavioral change in thinking about how to make us more resilient, more adaptable, to be better to handle the challenges that are coming forth. So let me now pass it over to Walter Willett, who's going to frame this now in a more nutritional perspective. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dan. Unfortunately, you'll see I am not actually Dr. Willett. We are still working out some technical difficulties, I'm afraid. But I'm going to jump in here because thankfully we have Dr. Willett's slides here. So we wanted to show them to you and talk through them a little bit. So what Dr. Willett was going to be talking about in this session was a new document that that he authored for us at the CIA, and we worked into that resources document that Greg had mentioned earlier on in the conference. You'll see here, Dr. Willett had brought together 6 lessons for the food system from the COVID-19 pandemic. And as he said, stay tuned for more. As this pandemic unfolds, obviously, we're going to be getting more lessons coming out of this. So you'll see here that there are consequences of our poor dietary patterns. And there's a price for late responses to major threats. As we've seen in the pandemic, many of the people who have been most impacted by the virus and who have suffered the worst consequences are people who had underlying health conditions such as obesity, such as heart issues. And these are things that are related to our diet and poor dietary patterns. And there is a price for late responses to major threats, as Dan sort of mentioned, looking at the ways in which governments responded to the pandemic and taking action. Delayed action really prevented us from being able to address the pandemic in the most effective way possible. And that's very similar to the issues with climate change, as Dan just mentioned, and the ways that the food system impacts climate change. Epidemics and environmental changes follow laws of nature. One thing that Dr. Willett writes about in our resources document in the 6 lessons is about how epidemics and environmental changes aren't following government policy and aren't following the politics of the situation, but rather they follow natural laws. So if there are certain laws to the virus transmission, that is going to happen, whether we decide politically that it is viable to wear masks or not to wear masks. Federal responses are critical, but state, local, and private sector leadership is invaluable. I think this also speaks to what Dan was saying in terms of that collective global action that needs to happen to address climate change. This is also similar for the food system in terms of all of the policies that need to happen from national and federal responses, but also the state, local, and the decisions that companies are making as well in terms of the private sector to lead in this pandemic. Number 5, greater resilience is needed for our food system to absorb inevitable shocks. I think that if you had talked to a climate change scientist some years ago and asked them if something like a pandemic could have been expected, they would have said yes, because they're used to looking out into the future and recognizing the need to build resilience into systems to be able to anticipate large changes and shocks to the system. And that's certainly what we're seeing here. And number 6, our world is interconnected and public health and environmental challenges demand global responses. I think Dan already kind of really highlighted that point and built out that point, showing that the response to everything that happens, as well as the issues that we need to confront in our food system to mitigate the impacts of climate change, all of those responses are interconnected and really demand a global response to that. And that is very similar with the pandemic as well, and with coronavirus, in terms of even if one community sort of addresses it in a certain way, because our world is so globalized, it all ends up impacting everyone else as well. So that was the very quick bullet form takeaways from our new document, 6 Lessons from the Pandemic, again, authored by Dr. Willett. And that is available on our website. If you got the email from earlier this week as well, we have a link to that. So please be sure to check that out. I think that we don't yet have Dr. Willett, but again, he was very prepared with his slides, and he had already prepared this takeaways lesson from his slides. So his takeaways from the presentation were going to be that the pandemic is having huge health and economic costs. And a return to normal would be a bad outcome, as we have been on a path leading to disaster for human and planetary health. I think we've seen this in many ways across the food industry already. We've talked about how from a labor standpoint, from financial standpoint, the restaurant industry and the food system as it was previously built was not on a stable foundation. And so if what we're trying to get to is an ideal place, we can't actually just rebuild for what it had been before, but we actually need to rebuild for the future that we're trying to create. We have the knowledge, creativity, and skills, including culinary insight and inspiration, that can create a future that is far healthier, more sustainable, and more just than what we have today. And finally, this will take time, and that is all the more reason to redouble our efforts now. I think going back to Michael's previous comments, when we talked about when this pandemic hit and we were considering whether or not to do menus of change, obviously in the acute crisis of the of the pandemic, it felt like there was a strong focus on the virus itself, and everything else kind of took a backseat. But as we looked at menus of change and as we looked at the work that we do here, it became all the more important for us to continue this work and to ensure that the industry that we are rebuilding and the food system that we are rebuilding is resilient, not just for something like a pandemic, but also for those long-term problems and those long timescale problems. So I'm afraid I certainly could not have actually done Dr. Willett's presentation full justice, but here was just a quick taster of what we were, or what he was planning to present. And I do believe we have him back now so he can answer some additional questions. So we're going to bring back Eliza and Dan and Walter, so that we can get back onto, oh, I'm sorry, I spoke too soon. We don't yet have Walter. But Eliza and Dan, maybe we can start to take some questions from the audience, or Eliza, I'm not sure if you had some original questions. And Dan, me not being any scientist of any kind, if I said anything wrong in trying to summarize Walter's points, now is your time to correct me.
Actually, Jackie, I'm blown away with how well you did. You are very good at what you do. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank
I think Walter would have been proud.
Thank you. Eliza, do you have some initial questions for Dan?
I guess, Dan, I'm curious. We've clearly seen some significant reductions in emissions overall, that may be temporary. And that's, for people very focused on climate change, that has been a silver lining of sorts of the pandemic. And more broadly, I wonder if there are sort of shifts that you see that the pandemic brought about, that we didn't anticipate, sort of involuntary shifts in behavior, consumption that we might think about carrying forward, and how can we sort of capitalize on, how can we turn this crisis into an opportunity, specifically with climate in mind?
I think that's a really interesting question. Unfortunately, I have to tell you that silver lining is probably not worth that much. And I'm sorry to disappoint you. I don't
Sure.
want to say bad news, but it's true that because we're not flying airplanes as much, we're not driving as much, we are not using as much energy. But it's a mild reduction. It's maybe a 10 or 15% effect around the world, but it's still significant. It's a big deal. If it were a permanent 10 or 15% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, I would be ecstatic. Unfortunately, it looks like it's a transient thing that's going to bounce back as soon as our economy bounces back. Now, when that will be is anyone's guess. I think it's an analogy to COVID is an interesting one. Many countries like Italy, like China, had to essentially shut down completely because of COVID was growing so badly. But they stayed shut down, and they really kept it completely closed until the rate of transmission dropped and the number of cases dropped, where they could really control it with continued testing and contact tracing and quarantining. The US did something different. We shut down, especially here in New England or in New York, severely. In other countries, they shut down a little less, but they didn't stay shut down for very long and decided they could reopen even though cases were not dropping in many places. Cases had not come down. And what we discovered was, sure enough, it once again grew back because, as Walter Willett said, the basic laws of physics and biology are still followed in these epidemics. Well, the same is true in climate change. A transient reduction actually means almost nothing. What matters to the atmosphere, to the Earth system, is the cumulative emissions integrated over a century or more. And so we need to ultimately transition our entire energy system and stop using fossil fuels. I actually think that food is not the major route to doing that, but it is an important route for creating awareness. I think for people, there's nothing more poignant about how we interact with the environment than the food we eat. And I think good cooking, good chefs can make people aware of those connections, whether it's by highlighting certain types of local things, certain things that are in season where you are, all sorts of special ways of using food to enter people's minds and enter their hearts. And I think that's the way to think about it.
Thank you, Dan. I actually have a question coming in from the audience, and Eliza, I wonder also from your reporting and covering this, if that's comes into play as well. We're seeing a lot around racism right now and social issues and racial justice. How does that intersect with the climate crisis and the pandemic and sort of the food system issues that we're looking at?
So I think it's very interesting. There's a well-established issue associated with climate change, which some people call environmental justice, which is the fact that, and this is true within our country, within everybody's region, but it's also true internationally, which is that many of the people who are likely to suffer the worst damages and the most vulnerable people are the people who actually have very little and ironically didn't contribute that much to the problem in the first place. And whether you're talking about poor neighborhoods in New Orleans that were completely flooded out during Hurricane Katrina, or whether you're talking about people in South Asia who are getting hit by heat waves or sea level rise, or whether you're talking about Pacific Islanders who basically never burned much fossil fuel in the first place and are now losing their homes, there's a fundamental issue of justice, which is people who haven't contributed to the problem are suffering the worst impacts. There's another part of this problem, though, that does also cut along racial and equality lines, which has to do with intergenerational justice. And that's a very interesting aspect of this. And what I mean by that is the question of what obligation we have to make sure that our children, our grandchildren, and generations beyond have the same kind of opportunities that we have. Now, it's pretty basic. Anybody who has kids knows that you have to clean up after your mess now. You can't just push it back to tomorrow. No good chef would make a huge mess in the kitchen and say, we'll deal with it tomorrow. You clean up after yourself. That's what you do. But we're not cleaning up after ourselves. Humans are making a mess, and we're not thinking about, we're basically pushing it off to future generations. And we have to think about that. And I think there are strong racial, national, and questions of fundamental fairness involved in all of this. I don't know if that helps answer the question, but.
Yeah, I love that sort of broader system view. Eliza, do you have some thoughts on that from the reporting that you've done?
Yes, so I think there's a fascinating and really hopeful convergence happening now, I think, in the climate policy world, and we at Vox in particular, a reporter on my team, David Roberts, has reported on this, that, of course, as Dan suggested, the environmental justice movement, the climate justice movement have been around for a long time. They've been fighting hard, raising awareness around how many communities of color bear the worst fronts of environmental harm, and also now increasingly climate change. And what I think is hopeful about what's happening now is that there is a kind of an alignment on the climate left, where the justice issues are really finally becoming much higher priority than they were. The justice issues for frontline communities were really not, central to a lot of climate policy discussions. But I think with the help of a lot of activism last year, and of course now this new wave of activism, Black Lives Matters, are elevating these issues again. And so I think, we also see the candidates, and we have seen the candidates, and now Biden talking much more about climate justice, environmental justice, and that is a bigger part of his climate policy package. So I think there really has been a rapid, much more inclusion of these issues in the sort of climate policy priorities on the left. And we actually are working on a project that will be out in the fall, and it's an anti-racism policy package of stories, and it's going to have a lot of components, but there will be an environmental justice piece of that. So look for it in October.
Yeah, that's great. Really looking forward to that. And we've got some questions coming in from the audience as well. Just a reminder to everyone watching out there, feel free to submit your questions through the chat. Actually, we have several questions, so I'm just going to scroll through here. I wonder, we've talked a little bit about the climate change aspect, bringing in the food systems part of this into climate change. How can we, the question for Dan is, how might the environmental science community better engage with chefs and food professionals who are in a position to help lead consumers towards better and more climate-friendly food choices?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I've got to say, it's interesting because it's a conversation that is, as far as I know, until I went to my first Menus of Change discussion about 5 years ago, essentially didn't happen. I don't think it's happening anywhere else outside of Menus of Change that I know of. I think there's work to be done in that respect, and I think there's a lot of opportunity. There's interesting trade-offs. Walter Willett and I, for example, have had long conversations over the last several years about farmed salmon. And turns out there are really good ways to farm salmon and really bad ways to farm salmon. You can feed salmon other fish from the ocean that you essentially scrape off the ocean floor, and that's incredibly damaging to marine ecosystems. Or you can raise salmon in a way that's relatively environmentally friendly. And we need to figure out the latter. We need to figure out how to do it in a good way. And chefs need to be aware of that. And frankly, what I've seen is that diners want their chefs to think about that. And I think that's really a collaboration between environmental scientists like myself, chefs, and frankly, eaters. Every one of us who consumes that delicious food that chefs create, I think we all need to participate in this kind of cultural change that's required. So I can't tell you that there's a great outlet that I've seen other than Menus of Change, but I would love to put my shoulder to the wheel and try and work with any chef who's interested in learning.
Well, we love that plug for our initiative, of course, but if you're not familiar, as you're watching this, we post all of our resources, all of our Menus of Change resources on our website, the infographics that Greg had pointed out, as well as some of these resource documents that we were talking about. We post that on our website and make that available to anybody. We, in some ways, appreciate being one outlet for bringing these conversations together, the environmental science, the nutrition, and the culinary side of things. But I think, to your point, Dan, in order for us to have more effective change, we can't be the only ones actually talking about this. We need to have broader and bigger coalitions of people working on this. Speaking of changing the culture, we had a question. Ken Tong was asking about how can we change the culture to sort of address these issues. And we also had a question about, everybody always sort of wants the easy, quick tips, right? The 3 things that we can be doing at home. And I wonder also, Eliza, if you could jump in here, again, sort of seeing the broad landscape of what is going on in this and certain solutions that you've seen or maybe leaders or innovations that you've seen that might contribute to solutions.
Eliza, you want to start?
Sure, I can quickly start. So I've actually been working on a piece and looking at some interesting new research about greenhouse gas emissions from the consumer side, and it's really interesting. We now have better data that, in fact, wealthy people are contributing a disproportionate amount of greenhouse gas emissions relative to everyone else. And I think there's some really interesting conversations now about it, sort of going back to is the pandemic an opportunity? Well, there are a number of researchers who see this, reduction in consumption, and maybe it's the biggest one is driving less, flying less. Is this a moment now where we can, and particularly the people who flew the most, is this an opportunity now to really say, hey, we need to be curbing, we have a moral obligation to future generations to really curtail our individual emissions. Of course, it's a huge systems problem, and as Dan referred to, we're gonna the emissions reductions we've seen lately are a blip, and yet there are unsustainable consumption patterns. So I guess I'm thinking a lot about this, about how much I or people in my family should go back to flying right after the pandemic, and to really think carefully about that as a major source of emissions. So Dan, I don't know, it's not a food thing, but clearly it's a cultural thing. So maybe we need to shift our culture in a way that's happening in Europe now. We see the Greta effect in Europe of people are flying less, driving less. They're bringing back night trains in Europe because people would prefer to take the train than fly because of the climate impacts, which I think is pretty fascinating.
Eliza, I think it's really interesting when you put your finger on what is to me a true dilemma, which is in some ways we want people to consume less, but in other ways we actually want people to be able to consume more. We just want to do it without an environmental footprint. And so obviously technology is a key to that. I would love to be able to have technology make it so that we can fly and see the world as much as possible, but without harming the environment in the process. And that's the real challenge. I'll tell you, one of the challenges with our global collective action problem is that individual action isn't very effective. And everybody wants to know, what can I do? And the answer is, demand more. Demand more of your friends, demand more of your families, demand more of your communities, and demand more, most of all, of your leaders. We need to ask for them to take this seriously. It's not reasonable for every single person to design public policy on this problem, but it is reasonable for every one of us to say to our political leaders, we want you to take this seriously. I don't care whether you're Republican or Democrat, whether you're conservative or liberal. There are plenty of good ideas on both sides of the aisle. There are plenty of good ideas across the political spectrum, but take this seriously. This is a problem and we need to solve it. And we can solve it together. And I think it's very interesting how food plays a fundamental role in our perception of these problems. And I think maybe that's a good place to end on.
That was a perfect ending, Dan. Thank you so much, Eliza and Dan, and especially thank you so much for pivoting with us and adjusting with us while we were trying to get Walter up here. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get him up here in time, but we're still trying to get him to the breakout session. So again, thank you very much, Eliza and Dan. We are now going to breakout sessions, and you'll be able to choose your breakout by going to the sessions tab on the left side of your screen. We know that all of these sessions look incredible, so you'll be happy to know that we'll be posting recordings of all of the content on our website, so you don't have to miss out by going to just one. Some of these sessions will have dedicated time for audience Q&A, so again, don't be shy. Just go ahead and hit that green share your audio and video button when prompted. As a reminder, after the breakout sessions, we'll be going into a networking break, which is when all those interactive features that I mentioned earlier will be activated, including, we hope, the Meet the Author booth with Dr. Walter Willett. So unfortunately, we weren't able to get him up here, but we're hoping that he's going to make it to the breakout session, which I believe is the A3 breakout session that he's going to be in now. And then during the break, he'll also be in the Meet the Author booth. We'll resume programming back here on the stage tab at 11:40 a.m. Pacific, which is 2:40 p.m. Eastern. So we will see you then. Enjoy your breakouts.